The late summer light over Belgium was the kind pilots remembered for the rest of their lives. Soft amber sun hanging low above a countryside, quilted with farms, rail lines, and smoke from burning convoys. It was the evening of Sunday, the 28th of August, 1944. 2 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 82nd Fighter Squadron, 78th Fighter Group, swept low across the Flemish fields, looking for what their operations orders called targets of opportunity. To the men in the cockpits, that meant anything that moved under a German cross. In the lead aircraft was Major Joseph Myers, 26 years old, already a combat veteran of the P-38 Lightning. His wingman was 2nd Lieutenant Manford Croy Jr., 23, on his 20th mission. Both men flew from Duxford, England, across the Channel that morning and had been airborne for nearly 2 hours. Their jugs were heavy with fuel and dusted with insect streaks from a disateripo, a day spent at treetop height. The radio was quiet except for the soft hum of the long-range set and the occasional crackle of ground control vectors. Then Myers saw it. At first it looked like sunlight glinting off a silver bird, a thin dart flashing west to east at an impossible speed. He blinked and leaned forward over the gun sight. It was no bird. It was an aircraft, sleek, swept, with engines slung beneath the wings. But the movement was wrong. It did not climb like a propeller plane. It streaked, smooth and effortless, without the faintest hint of propeller blur. "Blue 2, you see that?" Myers called. "I see it," Croy answered. "She's fast. What the hell is it?" Neither man knew they were watching the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me 262, flown that day by Oberfeldwebel Hieronymus Ronny Lauer of Kampfgeschwader 51. Lauer was ferrying the new machine from Juvincourt near Reims to the forward field at Chièvres, Belgium. His aircraft carried no ammunition. The mission was to deliver it intact for conversion to a fighter bomber. Myers banked left and opened throttle. The Thunderbolt's 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney roared, the big propeller biting hard into the humid air. The aircraft shuddered as manifold pressure rose. He pushed the nose down, building speed, the altimeter unwinding through 4,000 feet. Croy stayed welded to his tail, trimming furiously to hold position. Ahead, the jet began a shallow climb, then banked wide in an arc too fast for any piston fighter to match at altitude. But at this low height, the advantage was not so absolute. The Me-262's jet engines were slow to respond, and at reduced power they starved for thrust. Lauer realized he had been seen. He pushed both throttles forward, but the Junkers Jumo engines spooled up sluggishly, taking precious seconds to deliver full thrust. By then, the Thunderbolts were diving out of the sun. Croy saw the distance closing through the gunsight reflector ring 500 yards, then 4. The jet's tail shimmered with heat haze. "He's braking right," Croy called. Myers snapped his jug into a descending turn, pulling 5G. The Thunderbolt's wingtips quivered under the strain. Below them, the Belgian countryside unfolded like a relief map orchards. Stone barns, a line of poplars tracing a canal. The Me-262 dropped through a thin cloud layer, banking so steeply its silver belly flashed to the pursuers. Myers fired a short burst. Tracers arced out, falling short. The jet leveled, wobbling. One engine belched smoke. For Lauer, the gauges told the story. Fuel pressure was fluctuating. The port Jumo was overheating. He had throttled back too abruptly during the evasive turn, starving the compressor. The temperature needle surged toward red. Another minute of abuse and the turbine blades would fail. He had no choice. He chopped power, lowered the nose, and searched for a field long enough to land. From the Thunderbolt's cockpits, the Me-262 seemed to sink suddenly, gliding without the howl of propellers. "He's quitting!" Croy shouted. "He's landing," Myers corrected. "Stay high. Watch for flak." Lauer brought the jet down fast, flaps half, gear extended, skimming hedgerows. The Me-262 touched the ground near the village of Chièvres, bounced and slewed sideways. The starboard wheel collapsed, the aircraft spun, ploughing through a beet field and coming to rest in a spray of dirt. Lauer threw open the canopy and scrambled out, dazed but alive. From 2,000 feet above, the Thunderbolts circled once. Myers keyed his radio. "Blue 2, you're clear to make a pass. Burn it." Croy rolled inverted and dove. The P-47's 850 caliber Brownings opened in a thunderous 8-note chord, rows of tracers stitched across the wreck. Fuel vapors caught instantly. A pillar of black smoke rose from the field. The German pilot dropped flat beside a drainage ditch as his aircraft burned. "Good hits," Myers said quietly. "Let's head home." They turned west toward the setting sun. Behind them, the smoke column tilted with the evening breeze, marking the end of the Luftwaffe's first operational jet lost to American fighters. At Duxford that night, the debriefing officers were skeptical. The intelligence captain listened, pencil tapping his clipboard. "You're certain it had no propeller?" "None," Myers said. "Twin engine, straight wings, engines under the wings. Moved faster than anything I've ever seen," Croy added. "I strafed it after it went in. Looked like something out of Buck Rogers. Short nose, bubble canopy, swept tail." The captain frowned. "Could have been one of those rocket planes they talk about." "Sir, it was no rocket," Myers replied. "It was a jet." The wreckage confirmed it 2 days later, when Allied ground troops overran Chièvres airfield. The charred remains bore the markings of Messerschmitt Work No. 1, 70069. The pilot, Oberfeldwebel Lauer, had survived with minor injuries and was evacuated east before capture. The official report, filed through 8th Air Force Headquarters, credited Major Myers and 2nd Lieutenant Croy jointly with one Me-262 destroyed on the ground, the first German jet eliminated by United States Army Air Force's fighters. For Myers and Croy, it hardly felt like victory. They had seen something the world would soon learn to fear: an airplane without a propeller, faster than the wind, indifferent to the limitations of piston and prop torque. In the dim operations room that night, Myers studied the chalkboard listing German airfields. Tomorrow would bring another sweep, another mission, another string of names and numbers, but he knew they had crossed a threshold. The war had entered a new age, an age where the future moved too fast for the eye to follow. Out over Belgium, the field where the May 262 burned still smoked under a silver moon. A few villagers stood at the edge of the wreck, whispering about the strange machine that had fallen from the sky. One boy touched the scorched metal and drew back his hand in wonder. The wreckage still radiated heat, as if it contained some secret energy the world had only just begun to understand. The next morning, the farmer ploughed around the crater. The soil smelled of burned fuel and metal, the scent of a century being born in fire. The morning after the encounter, the intelligence hut at Duxford smelled of coffee and wet canvas. Rain tapped on the tin roof as technicians unrolled reconnaissance photos from Belgium, each frame showing the smouldering skeleton of an aircraft unlike anything they had seen before. The caption read simply, "Chièvres airfield, enemy machine destroyed unknown type." Major Joseph Myers leaned over the table, tracing the blurred outline of twin nacelles under the wings. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the thing we saw." By noon, confirmation arrived from 8th Air Force Headquarters. Interrogation of local civilians and a quick inspection by advancing ground troops identified the wreck as a Messerschmitt Me 262A1A, the world's first operational jet fighter. The German pilot had escaped but left behind logbooks and fragments of the aircraft's serial plate. Intelligence officers understood the importance immediately. The jet age had entered the European battlefield. To the Germans, the Me-262 was supposed to be a miracle weapon. The Reich was collapsing on every front, and in desperation the Luftwaffe pinned its hopes on this new machine. Two Junkers Jumo 004 engines gave it a top speed of over 500 miles per hour, 100 faster than the best Allied fighters. It carried 4 30mm cannon each round capable of tearing through a bomber like tissue paper. Yet, behind those dazzling statistics hid a litany of weaknesses. The engines burned out after 25 flight hours. The landing gear snapped on rough fields. and the fuel consumption drained Germany's dwindling reserves. For the United States Army Air Forces, the Thunderbolt represented the opposite philosophy. It was not elegant but indestructible. Its radial engine could take hits and keep turning. Its 850 caliber guns poured out a stream of lead that shredded anything unlucky enough to stay within the sight ring. The P-47 was the child of an industrial democracy, large, standardized, replaceable, built by the tens of thousands. In August of 1944, these two visions met by chance over the same patch of European sky. The news of the jet spread quickly through the fighter squadrons. Some pilots were skeptical. "No airplane can fly that fast," a lieutenant muttered in the mess hall. Others felt a cold thrill. If Germany had truly unleashed a new kind of engine, then every mission from now on carried a question mark. Could the old propeller-driven world still hold its own? Major Myers kept his thoughts to himself. He had fought long enough to know that technology alone did not win wars. Logistics did. Still, he could not forget the way the Me-262 had moved, the smoothness of its climb, the ghostly silence until its turbines spooled. It was like watching the future and realizing the present had already ended. In the following days, technical bulletins began circulating through 8th Air Force channels. They carried grainy sketches of the new enemy aircraft, labeled jet-propelled fighter, estimated speed 500 plus. The instructions were blunt: attack during takeoff or landing when speed advantage is lost. Do not engage in level pursuit. Use altitude and surprise. These notes would later form the backbone of Allied anti-jet tactics. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Germans scrambled to rebuild and what had been lost. At Juvincourt, mechanics cursed the shortage of spare turbines and the fragility of their miracle engines. Oberfeldwebel Lauer, the pilot whose forced landing had cost Germany its first operational jet, filed a brief statement with his unit. Fuel pressure fluctuated. Port engine failed. Landed near Chièvres. Aircraft destroyed by enemy fighters after landing. He did not mention the fear he had felt watching the tracers crawl toward him, or the humiliation of seeing his proud new machine reduced to wreckage in a farmer's field. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry ignored the loss entirely. Newspapers spoke of our revolutionary air weapon, cutting through Allied bomber streams. The truth was simpler and crueler. Germany had built a weapon that required a perfect world, steady fuel, unbombed factories, trained mechanics, but it existed inside a crumbling one. For Myers and Croy, the war went on as usual. Patrol, escort, strafe, return. Yet each flight carried the faint edge of anticipation. Every glint on the horizon could be another jet. On one afternoon mission over the Netherlands, Croy caught himself tightening the throttle at the sight of a silver speck, only to realize it was sunlight on a canal. At squadron briefings, the intelligence officers emphasized vigilance. "If you see one of these new types," they said, "don't chase it at altitude. Dive through, use your momentum, and catch it near its base. They're fast, but they're not invincible." The pilots took notes, half believing, half doubting. The 8th Air Force Command understood the symbolic weight of the Chièvres kill. It proved that even the most advanced enemy weapon could be defeated by training, patience, and sheer persistence. Photographs of the wreck were circulated to all fighter groups. On the back of one print, someone scribbled in grease pencil, "The first jet downed by the jug." By early September, engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence unit arrived at the site. They measured the wreckage, photographed the turbines, and shipped fragments back to England for study. Within weeks, Lockheed and Rolls-Royce specialists were examining the alloy composition of the Jumo blades. The captured data would influence the next generation of American jet development, the very technology that, within 2 years, would give birth to the Shooting Star and the Meteor. But on that rainy morning at Duxford, none of that mattered yet. Myers stood beside his Thunderbolt, helmet tucked under one arm, watching mechanics reload the 8 guns. Croy walked up with a grin. "Think they'll ever give us credit for that thing?" he asked. "They'll have to," Myers said. There's nothing else it could have been. Croy looked toward the horizon, where the clouds were breaking into streaks of pale blue. You think we'll see another one? Myers adjusted his flight gloves. I think, he said, we already saw the beginning of what's coming next. The engines of the P-47s coughed to life, sending ripples through the puddles on the tarmac. As the two aircraft taxied out for another patrol, the air smelled of oil and promise. Somewhere across the channel, German mechanics were coaxing a new jet to the runway, its turbines whining toward the edge of the possible. Neither side knew it, but the race for the future had begun. By midsummer of 1944, the European air war had become an equation of numbers rather than courage. Each dawn began with the distant rumble of thousands of engines, waves of flying fortresses and liberators, lifting from England's airfields like migrating birds of metal. Behind them came the escorts, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, their wingtips flashing white in the morning haze. Every mission carried the same grim rhythm: takeoff, rendezvous, climb, contact, and loss. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, was disintegrating under the weight of arithmetic. Allied factories built planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons that still had aircraft. Pilots with only 30 flight hours faced veterans of 300. The Reich's answer was desperation dressed as innovation. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, and the rocket-powered Me 163 were not just machines, they were acts of faith. In July, the first jet units Commando Nowotny and Commando Schenk began tentative operations against Allied bomber streams over northern France and western Germany. They were small formations, usually 4 or 6 aircraft, each pilot under strict orders to avoid dogfights and attack only from advantageous positions. The jet's strength lay in its speed. It could slash through a bomber formation before gunners had time to track it. But every sortie was a gamble. The Jumo 004 engines had to be nursed to full power, and even a small piece of flak could destroy them. Pilots described each takeoff as rolling dice with death. Oberfeldwebel Hieronymus Ronny Lauer had watched one of those dice rolls end badly at Juvincourt in early August. A fellow pilot, Feldwebel Hans Stotz, attempted a takeoff with uneven thrust and lost control before clearing the field. The jet exploded, scattering turbine blades like shrapnel. Mechanics gathered the pieces in silence. There were no replacements. That memory haunted Lauer during his own ferry flight later that month, the mission that would end in a Belgian beat field. While Germany's miracle machines sputtered toward the front, the United States 8th Air Force was turning aerial warfare into a science of logistics. Each raid involved thousands of pages of planning fuel loads, assembly points, timing, weather charts, and escort rotations. The bombers over Europe were no longer adventurers but moving parts in an industrial process designed to grind an enemy into dust. The first reports of jets appeared in mid-July, near Munich. B-17 crews described silver shapes without propellers, diving at incredible speed. Gunners swore the aircraft vanished before they could even traverse their turrets. The intelligence analysts at High Wycombe examined the claims and hesitated. Was this real or just combat fatigue and rumour? By August, confirmation arrived through aerial photography. 2 sleek aircraft, twin-engine, parked on a dispersal strip at Lechfeld, their wings shimmering from heat haze. The Allied reaction was both analytical and instinctive. The photographs were copied and distributed under the heading Jet-Propelled Fighter, Immediate Priority Target. 8th Air Force planners marked the associated factories Augsburg, Regensburg, Schweidnitz for sustained bombing. For every Me-262 that reached the front, Allied heavy bombers destroyed 10 still on the assembly line. Back in England, the airfields were alive with talk. Pilots passed, around grainy prints showing the jet's silhouette. "If you see this thing," an intelligence officer warned at Duxford, "do not climb, dive, attack when it lands. It cannot run on the ground." The advice was practical and prophetic. Major Joseph Myers read those bulletins during early September and recognized the pattern. The Germans were repeating an old mistake, putting faith in single weapons instead of supply chains. He remembered Operation Vengeance in the Pacific the previous year, when American P-38 pilots had intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's bomber by following mathematics and timing, not luck. That mission had proved that precision and planning could kill even the most elusive target. The same truth now applied in Europe. Numbers, not myth, decided outcomes. Still, the idea of jets unsettled the men. The first time Myers saw a contrail at 40,000 feet without an engine note, his stomach tightened. "That's one of them," Croy muttered on the radio. They gave chase, throttles wide open, but the streak vanished eastward faster than their speed indicators could follow. Later, they learned it was likely a reconnaissance Arado 234, the world's first jet bomber. The Air Force Historical Research Agency would later record those weeks as the moment when the air war entered its second phase, the transition from mechanical flight to the dawn of the turbine. But to the pilots flying through flak and weather, it felt less like a revolution than a haunting. The sky no longer belonged entirely to men with propellers. Something colder had arrived, something that did not sound like wind or piston but like the hiss of the future itself. In late August, the 78th Fighter Group received orders to increase low-level patrols over northern Belgium and the Netherlands. The objective was to intercept any ferrying flights of advanced enemy aircraft relocating east. That directive led Myers and Croy to their encounter on the 28th. By pure chance, their patrol line crossed Lauer's route from Juvincourt to Chièvres. Had the Germans chosen to fly an hour earlier, clouds would have hidden them. History often hinges on the smallest fractions of timing. In the aftermath, 8th Air Force Intelligence updated its recognition manuals. The Chièvres wreck confirmed that jets were not invincible, merely fast, fragile, and limited by fuel. Analysts calculated that each Me-262 sortie consumed nearly 3 times the fuel of a conventional fighter. In a Reich already strangled by shortages, that figure amounted to a strategic suicide note. The German pilot's diary, recovered months later, carried a final entry dated the day before his flight. "Engines temperamental, mechanics nervous. We are told this aircraft will change the war. I hope the war will allow it to start first." For the Allies, that single jet lying twisted in a Belgian field symbolized the turning of eras. The propeller age had drawn, in its last breath, yet the jet age arrived too late to save those who invented it. At Duxford, the pilots of the 78th Fighter Group gathered in the twilight outside their Nissan huts, watching new Thunderbolts arrive from the factory, each one polished and smelling of paint and oil. Somewhere in the distance, the engines of a departing transport echoed faintly, a reminder that the war was still raging across a continent. Myers looked up and thought of the jet's smooth, silent dive through the clouds. The future, he realized, would belong to those who could not only build such machines but fuel them, maintain them, and multiply them by the thousands. War, he knew, had become less about bravery and more about production lines, fuel drums, and mathematics. And somewhere in Germany, men were still praying that miracles could replace numbers. In the first days of September 1944, the front lines rolled over the Belgian plains like a tide. British armoured columns pushed east through liberated villages. American infantry followed behind them, and with them came the engineers, correspondents, and intelligence teams who gathered the artifacts of a dying empire. Among those artifacts was the twisted carcass of the Messerschmitt Me 262 that Major Joseph Myers and Lieutenant Manford Croy had left burning outside Chièvres. When the Allied technical officers arrived, the wreck still reeked of kerosene and scorched earth. Its once sleek fuselage lay split like a shell, one wing buried in the soil. The turbines, though cracked and melted, were still objects of awe. Sergeant William Telfer, an engineer with the 9th Air Force Recovery Detachment, later wrote in his notebook, "It looked like something from another planet, half burned, half alive, like the future had fallen out of the sky. They took everything that could be pried loose. Broken compressor blades, control linkages, fragments of alloyed steel. A small team from the Air Technical Intelligence Unit arrived 2 days later, carrying crates stenciled with top secret propulsion. Their orders came directly from London: recover every identifiable component and ship it to Farnborough for examination. A week later, the parts crossed the Channel under armed guard, marking the first captured jet hardware delivered to Allied scientists. The locals of Chièvres were less impressed by technology. For them, the wreck meant only danger and fascination. Children scavenged bits of metal for souvenirs. Farmers cursed the deep furrows left by the landing. Yet, even they sensed something uncanny about the thing that had fallen from the clouds. "It came without sound," one villager told a British reporter. "Only the wind after it passed." At Duxford, Myers received a terse message of commendation from 8th Air Force Headquarters. "Good work. Intelligence confirms target was jet aircraft type, Me 262. Your action provides first verified destruction of enemy jet by Allied fighter." There were no medals attached, no ceremony. The war had too many heroes to count, and the brass preferred silence when it came to new enemy weapons. But within the fighter community, word spread quickly. The men who had seen the future and lived to tell about it became something like legends. Myers felt no triumph. When he closed his eyes at night, he saw the jet still gliding, wounded and graceful, until it met the earth. He could not help but feel that history had turned a corner in that Belgian field. The machine they had destroyed was not just another enemy, it was a glimpse of what all their own aircraft would soon become. By autumn, Allied intelligence confirmed that jet bases existed at Lechfeld, Rechlin, and Akma. Reports described more than 100 operational Me 262s, though only a fraction were flyable. The Luftwaffe's problem was not invention, but exhaustion. No fuel, no spares, no trained mechanics. The miracle weapon had arrived in a world too broken to sustain it. In early October, Myers and Croy were reassigned to bomber escort duty over Germany. Their P-47s climbed through icy skies toward the Rhine, guarding the great grey streams of B-17s. Occasionally they spotted the new jets slicing through the formations at impossible speed, firing short bursts before vanishing. But now the Thunderbolt pilots knew what to expect. They stayed high, waited for the jets to descend, and dove after them when they slowed to land. Several more were destroyed in the following months, not through luck, but through understanding. When the war ended, the field near Chièvres was ploughed under and replanted with beets. Only a few fragments of scorched metal remained, turned up by ploughs each spring. One of them, a curved turbine vane, was eventually sent to the Smithsonian's collection, labelled simply Me 262 Wreckage, Belgium, August 1944. Years later, at a reunion of the 78th Fighter Group, Croy would raise a glass and say softly, "We didn't know it then, but we shot down the first page of the next chapter." And in a way, he was right. The story of the jet's birth and death in that quiet Belgian field marked the dividing line between two worlds, one driven by pistons and courage, the other by turbines and mathematics. The first jet kill of the Second World War was not merely an ending, it was the sound of history accelerating. Autumn deepened across Europe, and the skies over Germany filled with both promise and ruin. Factories that had once hummed with confidence now stood half-shattered, roofs peeled back by bombs, walls pocked with shrapnel. Yet, inside these skeletal halls, the work continued. Nervous engineers, teenage apprentices, and aging machinists, building machines the Reich could no longer afford to fly. Among them were the Me 262s, assembled at Lechfeld under constant threat of air raids. Oberfeldwebel Hieronymus Ronny, Lauer limped through one of those hangars in late October 1944. His legs still ached from the crash near Chièvres, but he had returned to duty, reassigned to a new jet training detachment under Major Walter Novotny. Around him, the noise of desperate invention filled the air compressor, shrieks from test runs, hammers echoing on aluminum, shouted instructions. Every sound carried the urgency of collapse. Lauer knew the truth his superiors would not admit. Germany had built a miracle too late. Even now, the 8th Air Force struck daily at the synthetic fuel plants, and pilots of JG-7, the first full jet wing, rationed every drop of aviation spirit. The Me-262 could fly barely 1 hour before its tanks ran dry. To save fuel, pilots were ordered to idle taxi for takeoff, nursing the engines like fragile hearts. On the ground, they looked invincible, sleek, silver, more shark than airplane. In the air, they were both gods and ghosts. When they roared past bomber formations at 500 miles per hour, American gunners often froze in disbelief. They came out of nowhere, a B-17 tail gunner later recalled. No sound, no warning, just flashes, and then gone. But those miracles were fleeting. The same jet that outran pursuit also outran its own advantage. For once its tanks ran dry, it had to land on fields lined with wrecks and craters, where Thunderbolts and Mustangs waited above like hawks. At Duxford, Major Joseph Myers studied the pattern. Reports from reconnaissance squadrons showed that the German jets used a handful of predictable dispersal strips: Lechfeld, Achmer, Rheine, and Brandenburg. Command ordered all fighter groups to keep patrols near these bases from dawn to dusk. Catch them before they climb, the briefing officers said. They're deadly at altitude but helpless on the runway. Myers and Lieutenant Manford Croy took those orders to heart. Their squadron began rotating top cover sweeps, orbiting over likely approach paths at 20,000 feet. The tactic worked. In early November, Thunderbolts of the 78th Fighter Group destroyed 2 Me-262s as they tried to land near Rheine. It was not chivalrous combat, it was arithmetic justice. Meanwhile, in Germany, Major Nowotny faced his own reckoning. The Luftwaffe's propaganda hailed him as the jet ace, the savior who would turn back the bomber streams. But his men saw the strain behind his calm. Every sortie meant gambling his life on engines that might flame out mid-flight. On the 8th of November, he lost that gamble. Both turbines failed during combat with P-51s of the 4th Fighter Group. Witnesses saw his Me-262 dive steeply, then explode near Epée. When word reached Lechfeld, Lauer said nothing. He simply removed his flight gloves and placed them on his bunk. Across the Channel, the Allies read the same reports with grim satisfaction. The once mythical jets were mortal after all. Each one destroyed meant another edge blunted, another myth punctured. Yet Myers could not shake a peculiar respect for the men who flew them. They're trapped by their own invention, he told Croy one night in the mess tent. They built the future, but they're dying in the past. By late November, Allied control of the air was absolute. The Thunderbolts roamed across France, Belgium, and Western Germany unchallenged except for the occasional jet strike. The Me-262s still appeared, flashing like silver knives in sunlight, but their sorties grew fewer each week. Bombing raids on Lechfeld had reduced production to a trickle. Engineers began burying half-finished fuselages in forest clearings, hoping to protect them from air attacks that came daily, even hourly. And yet, even as Germany crumbled, its engineers worked feverishly on new prototypes: the Heinkel 162, the Me-262B night fighter, even a planned interceptor with rocket-assisted climb. None would reach combat in numbers. The Reich was running on fumes, its miracle engines sucking the last breath of a dying state. For the pilots of the 78th Fighter Group, the war's tone changed too. There was less tension now, more inevitability. They still flew their daily sweeps, but the sense of danger that had hung over England in 43 was gone. Even the weather seemed to conspire in their favour, calm skies stretching across Europe as if the continent itself were holding its breath for the end. In mid-December, Myers was ordered to brief new pilots on the threat of jets. He stood before them, chalk in hand, and drew a simple diagram on the board. An oval representing a German airfield, a dotted line showing the climb path, and an arrow descending from above. This, he said, is how you kill a miracle. By Christmas, few Me-262s remained in service. Fuel shortages and airfield bombings grounded most of them. The last operational sorties came from Brandenburg and Prague in early 45, brief flares of brilliance against an encroaching night. When the Thunderbolt squadrons read those reports, they felt neither triumph nor hatred, only a quiet recognition that the age of propeller-driven heroes was nearly over. The next generation would fight in jets, not jugs, and the men who had seen both would carry the sound of that transition forever. For Myers and Croy, the memory of the Chièvres encounter became something larger than a mission report. It was the moment when history blinked, when the old world and the new shared the same sky for a heartbeat before diverging forever. In the spring of 1945, as the guns fell silent, Myers wrote one final line in his combat diary. "The future came to meet us over Belgium. We were lucky enough to arrive first." By the dawn of 1945, the air over Germany had become a graveyard of smoke and condensation trails. The Reich still clung to its dream of the Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons that could reverse the inevitable, but even miracles need fuel, pilots, and time commodities that no longer existed. Every factory was under bombardment, every airfield cratered, every supply line cut. What remained of the Luftwaffe was an illusion, a handful of jets and piston fighters darting through the ruins of an empire. At Lechfeld, where the first Me 262s had been born, frost lay thick on the runways. Mechanics lit fires in oil drums just to keep their hands from freezing while they worked on engines that would never be replaced. Oberfeldwebel Hieronymus Ronny Lauer returned there briefly in January, now grounded and half disillusioned. He watched as a dozen unfinished fuselages were wheeled out of bombed-out hangars, their wings still unpainted, the aluminum cold and raw. "They told us these machines would save us," he wrote in his notebook, "but they can't even save themselves." The German jet program had become a symbol of both genius and futility. Technically, it was decades ahead of its time. Strategically, it was already obsolete. Pilots like Lauer were thrown into battle with barely an hour of training on turbines that failed as often as they flew. By contrast, the Americans now had the luxury of system and rhythm. Every morning at Duxford, the 78th Fighter Group launched patrols like clockwork thunderbolts loaded with bombs or drop tanks, roaring east in squadrons of 16 or 20. Their engines no longer sounded strained, they sounded inevitable. Major Joseph Myers had flown more than 100 missions by then. His P-47, nicknamed Brass Halo, carried faint scars from earlier combats and the chipped paint of winter weathering. He no longer felt the tremor of nerves before takeoff. War had become a profession of habit. Strap in, check gauges, line up, throttle forward, feel the surge, lift into grey daylight. Only afterward, in the quiet after, at landing, did the enormity of what they were witnessing truly register. Each day brought new fragments of reports from the intelligence section's jets appearing near Berlin, others destroyed on the ground near Munich, a few still managing brief bursts of success. On the 14th of January, Me 262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 struck a formation of American bombers near Kassel, downing several before running out of fuel. The attacks were ferocious but futile. As Myers read the summaries, he realized the pattern repeated endlessly. Speed, impact, exhaustion, silence. On the 23rd of February, Myers and his wingmen swept over the Rhine. Below them lay a broken landscape of snow, rails, and rivers turned black by oil fires. They saw one of the new jets take off from a narrow road strip, its engines glowing orange against the dusk. For a heartbeat, the Me 262 seemed to defy gravity itself, rising smoothly through their altitude. Croy shouted over the radio, "There's one, 11 o'clock low." Myers rolled and dived, but the jet was already gone, a blur streaking toward cloud cover. They did not even fire. Instead, they watched it vanish eastward, an apparition of power fleeing its own defeat. By March, American pilots had learned to read the jet's limitations. The Me 262 could accelerate beyond anything with propellers, but it could not maneuver sharply nor re-engage once it overshot. Thunderbolt formations exploited that flaw ruthlessly. They pass like ghosts, Croy noted in his logbook, but when they slow, they die. At the same time, the Allied engineers were already building their answer. At Lockheed's plant in California, the P-80 Shooting Star began production, an American jet fighter born directly from the study of wrecks like the one Myers and Croy had left burning in Belgium. Its turbines were smooth, its structure sound, its performance free from the German engine's fragility. The race that had begun in that beat field was ending before it truly started. On the ground, the consequences of air supremacy became absolute. Supply trains vanished beneath Thunderbolt strafing runs, bridges collapsed, columns of vehicles burned day and night. The Wehrmacht's last reserves moved only after dusk, and even then, the roar of engines overhead sent soldiers diving for ditches. Survivors called the American fighter bombers J-Boss, a contraction of Jagged Bomber, a name that became a synonym for dread. In April, with Berlin encircled and the war nearly done, Myers flew his final combat sortie. The mission was routine: patrol over northern Germany to intercept any last-minute ferry flights. The weather was bright and thinly clouded, the kind of air that made the world feel endless. They saw no enemy aircraft, only the remains of dozens of airfields reduced to scars of concrete. When they landed back in England, the mechanics greeted them with quiet smiles and the unspoken truth that this might be their last time under fire. That night, in the officers' mess, Myers poured a small glass of whiskey and stared at a newspaper photo pinned to the wall. It showed the ruins of a German jet factory, fuselages half buried in rubble, a caption reading, "The End of the Luftwaffe." He thought of Lauer, the young man he had never met, but somehow knew and wondered if he was still alive somewhere among the wreckage. When the surrender came in May, it brought no elation, only release. Myers walked across the quiet airfield at dawn, the grass silvered with dew. A single Thunderbolt taxied slowly along the perimeter track, its radial engine rumbling like a heartbeat. Beyond the horizon, the jet age was already awakening. He removed his flight gloves, folded them carefully, and whispered a private benediction for all the engines, piston and turbine alike that had carried men through fire and time. "We flew the last of the old world," he murmured, and chased, the first of the new. The war ended officially on the 8th of May, 1945. Across Europe, bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and bonfires lit the night. But for the men who had lived their war in the air, the silence afterward was deafening. At Duxford, the 78th Fighter Group lined their Thunderbolts wingtip to wingtip on the grass and stood before them without ceremony. The machines that had carried them through flame and storm were suddenly relics. The sky, which had once been their battlefield, was now too quiet to bear. Major Joseph Myers received his orders that same week deactivation and returned to the United States. Lieutenant Manford Croy would follow later, assigned to ferry aircraft for occupation duty in Germany. They spent their final days at the base, dismantling the routines that had governed their lives. Logbooks closed, sidearms turned in, code tables burned. The war was over, but the war inside them lingered. On his last afternoon in England, Myers took a jeep north toward Cambridge, then stopped at a small field of crosses near Madingley. Beneath one of the markers lay a name he recognized from early missions, a pilot lost in 43 when the Luftwaffe still ruled daylight. He stood there for a long while, listening to the wind through the grass. The peace he had imagined felt strangely hollow. Victory, he realized, was only the absence of resistance. The weight of what they had done, the factories burned, the cities leveled, the thousands of silent deaths pressed on him like gravity. Before leaving, he reached into his flight jacket and unfolded a photograph. The wreck of the Me 262 near Chièvres, taken months earlier by a reconnaissance crew. The jet lay mangled and half buried in earth, its once smooth fuselage blackened by fire. Myers had kept the picture as a reminder not of triumph, but of transition. That machine, he thought, had been both the enemy and the herald of what would come next. 2 months later, in July, he found himself again on European soil, this time in uniform, but without a weapon. He had been seconded to the Allied technical mission in Germany, part of a team studying captured technology. His orders were simple: evaluate the Me 262 program and its influence on future aircraft design. The irony was not lost on him. He had destroyed the first German jet to fall to American fighters. Now he was tasked with learning from its remains. The team travelled south from Frankfurt through a landscape still smouldering from defeat. Burned towns, abandoned tanks, and refugees lined the roads. At Lechfeld, they found rows of wrecked jets, some intact, others stripped by souvenir hunters or scavenged for scrap. In a hangar still bearing bomb holes, British and American engineers worked side by side, measuring engine components, taking notes, and shaking their heads in disbelief at the ingenuity buried beneath ruin. One of the German engineers, a thin man in a torn uniform, approached Myers as he examined a turbine. "You shot one of these down, did you not?" he asked quietly in English. "I did," Myers replied. "Or rather, I shot it after it landed." The man smiled faintly. "That's the right way to fight them. On the ground, they were nothing but fuel and fear." He hesitated, then added, "You should know we admired your Thunderbolt. It was ugly, yes, but indestructible. We could never build something like it. Too heavy, too simple, too American." Myers nodded. "And yet you built this," he said, gesturing to the shattered jet. "Something too far ahead for its own time." The German engineer's smile faded. "The problem was not time," he said. "The problem was that we ran out of everything else." That evening, as dusk fell over Lechfeld, Myers walked among the wrecks. The air smelled of oil and ash. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed a strange, living sound in a place of ghosts. He stopped, beside a broken Me 262, its canopy missing, its nose crushed. Inside the cockpit, a faded stencil still bore the words, "Nicht anfassen, Hochspannung," do not touch, high voltage. It felt like a warning from the past to the future. Back in England, he reported his findings. The jet's design was brilliant but flawed, its engines underpowered and unreliable. Yet he added a line in his report that the clerks almost missed. "The concept itself is sound. Properly built and maintained, this aircraft could change everything." In the following years, that prediction proved true. American engineers at Lockheed and North American drew directly from the data captured at Lechfeld. The Shooting Star, the Sabre, and the Thunderjet all bore traces of the machine that had once fallen burning in a Belgian field. For Myers, the war never truly ended, it simply evolved beyond him. He returned to civilian life, taught flying for a while, and then, in 1950, watched jet fighters scream overhead during the Korean conflict. They moved faster than anything he had ever flown, leaving contrails like white scars across the blue. "The ghosts of Chièvres," he murmured to himself one afternoon as he looked skyward, still flying. When he finally retired to a small farm in Virginia, he kept 2 souvenirs on his mantel, a bent, .50 caliber shell from his own Thunderbolt, and a turbine fragment from the Me 262. The metal was warped and dull, but under sunlight it glimmered faintly as if it still remembered speed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Myers would tell visitors about that day over Belgium, about the strange shape rising through the clouds, about how the future had come too soon. "We didn't defeat the jet," he would say softly. "We just met it before it was ready." And in the fields of Chièvres, long reclaimed by crops, farmers still turned up fragments of alloy each spring small, stubborn reminders of a day when mankind first glimpsed the next century and, for a fleeting moment, tried to shoot it down. By the early 1950s, the noise of the new age filled every sky. Jets, not propellers, defined the horizon, now arrows of polished aluminum slicing through air that had once belonged to the piston roar of Thunderbolts and Mustangs. In that new world, Major Joseph Myers was both witness and relic. He had seen the future rise in fire and wreckage, and now he watched it take command of peace. He spent those years quietly, first as a flight instructor in Virginia, then as a consultant for an aerospace contractor that tested early turbine engines for the United States Air Force. The company operated out of a converted Army hangar near Dayton, not far from where the Wright brothers had first learned to command flight. The irony was not lost on him. He was helping to design engines that had once been his enemy's dream. Every morning he drove to the airfield before dawn, the mist still clinging to the tarmac. Test pilots, boys barely 20, arrived in leather jackets that looked like his once had, laughing, impatient, immortal. He would stand by the fence and watch them climb into sleek jets that left behind the familiar cough of cylinders and the rhythm of propellers. The new machines didn't throb or shake, they whispered. The age of muscle and vibration had yielded to the era of thrust and smooth acceleration. But inside, Myers lingered a paradoxical melancholy. The war had taught him that progress often came from catastrophe, that every advance in flight was purchased by ruin. The Me-262 that had burned near Chièvres was now part of every aircraft flying overhead, its ghost encoded in blueprints and factory lines. When he looked at a jet engine's glowing core, he could still smell the Belgian mud and the acrid smoke of that first crash. In the summer of 1952, Myers received an invitation from the Air Force Historical Division. They were assembling a symposium on the evolution of air power, bringing together veterans from both sides of the war. The location, Maxwell Field, Alabama. Among the attendees would be several German engineers and pilots who had been repatriated under Operation Paperclip. He hesitated, but curiosity overcame reluctance. At the conference, the past walked the halls again. He recognized names from old intelligence briefings: Heinkel, von Ohain, Lippisch. Men who had built machines that once tried to kill him now discussed aerodynamics over coffee. They were older, humbler, even grateful to be alive. During one panel, a German engineer displayed a photograph of the Me-262 and spoke of its legacy. "We built it in desperation," he said. "It taught the world how to build without fear." That night, in the officers' club, Myers found himself seated beside a tall, silver-haired man with an accent he could not place until the man extended his hand. "Hieronymus Lauer," he said softly. "You may not remember me, but I think I remember you." For a moment, Myers froze. The name struck like lightning. The Me-262 pilot, the one who had crash-landed near Chièvres, had survived. Lauer smiled faintly. "You shot at me after I landed. You had every right to. War makes its own rules. But I always wanted to know who it was that turned my flight into history." Myers studied him older, lined, but with the same clear blue eyes that intelligence reports had described years ago. "I didn't know you lived," Myers said quietly. "We thought the wreck burned completely." "It nearly did," Lauer replied, "but the farmer pulled me out before the flames reached the cockpit. I spent months in a hospital, then years in thought. Now I design turbines for the Americans. Strange, isn't it? You and I, two sides of the same machine." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the bar fading into memory. Then Lauer raised his glass. "To the first jet, kill," he said, "and to the first man who knew what it meant." Myers returned the toast, his expression unreadable. "To the last propeller that ever caught up with the future." The two men spoke until midnight about war, invention, and the strange brotherhood of those who had survived it. Lauer confessed that he had always felt guilt, not for losing the fight, but for flying a weapon built from fear. "We were told it would save Germany," he said, "but it was never about saving. It was about outrunning the truth." When the conference ended, Myers drove home through the southern countryside, the road stretching straight and quiet beneath a vast sky. Every contrail above seemed a signature written by ghosts. He realized then that history's circle had closed. The Me-262 had been reborn in the American jet age, its spirit cleansed of ideology, its speed reclaimed for progress. Years later, when Myers retired, he often sat on his porch at dusk, watching. Commercial jets climbed toward the fading sun. Their silver bellies caught the light just as the German jet had that August evening over Belgium. He would close his eyes and hear again the thunder of his old Pratt & Whitney engine, the steady percussion of 850 caliber guns, the moment the world changed forever. On the 28th of August, 1959, exactly 15 years to the day after that encounter, Myers took one last flight. A local flying club had restored a P-47 to airworthy condition and asked him to make a commemorative run over the same Belgian countryside. He agreed on one condition: no ceremony, no speeches, just the sky. He lifted off under clear morning light, the engine rumbling like a heartbeat resurrected from history. Over Chièvres, he banked slowly, tracing the arc of the field where the jet had once fallen. The farmlands below looked peaceful, the scars long healed. For a moment, he imagined that beneath the soil, pieces of twisted aluminum still remembered the sound of his guns. As he turned for home, the radio crackled. A Belgian control officer, unaware of who he was, called out cheerfully, "Thunderbolt, you are flying over sacred ground today." Myers smiled. "Copy that," he answered, "just paying respects." The sun glinted off the wings, old metal gleaming against the new century. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the past and the present were flying side by side once more, the propeller's roar harmonizing with the faint whisper of jet engines somewhere beyond the clouds. When he landed, he sat in the cockpit for a long time, hands resting on the throttle, eyes closed. In that stillness, the war, the noise, the chase, all of it folded into a single truth. The future had arrived long ago. He had simply been there to greet it.